Okay. Good afternoon, Senator Pangilinan, Senator Angara, Senator Bamakino, and Senator Gatchalian. Thank you for the opportunity to once again speak in the Senate hearing on constitutional amendments. Since I only have a few minutes, let me go straight to the point. The proposed constitution of the Consultative Committee, CONCOM, submitted to President Duterte on July 9, is the third federal constitution produced under the Duterte administration. Like the resolution of both houses number 8 by Representatives Eugene De Vera and Aurelio Gonzalez Jr. in 2016, and the Constitution of the Federal Republic of the Philippines by the PDP-Laban Federalism Study Group in 2017, the institutional design of its federalism and overall constitution is a failure. In terms of institutional design, the CONCOM Constitution is best described as a grocery list of institutions whose unifying logic is that the members were given a long pad to write their preferred items on. For the CONCOM Constitution, together with the ever so confident statements of the members of the committee, was written as if it was confined in an intellectual vacuum, where it has remained untouched by the critical insights of the literature on institutional design in political science. This is the very literature that specializes on what the committee was trying to do and populated by top scholars acknowledged as the real experts on these institutional design questions. It is true that the CONCOM Constitution is not as crazy as the PDP-Laban Constitution that argued for a simultaneous federal and semi-presidential transition. But it is also true that although it rejected a semi-presidential transition, the CONCOM Constitution is nevertheless still sweeping in its planned transition to federalism and the restructuring of key political institutions. Such sweep includes, and this is peculiar to this Constitution, a mind-boggling overhaul of the institutional design of the judicial system, now with quadrilateral high courts and a separated system of federal and regional level judiciary, and whose elaborate review, advisory, and impeachment powers seem to compete for the spotlight with the federal structure that it is introducing. The CONCOM Constitution's explicit provisions on federalism, political dynasties, political parties, judiciary, federal constitutional commissions, etc., and the all-important implicit assumptions that underline them, seem to ignore, undermine, contradict, or are simply blissfully unaware of the many basic principles and serious concerns of the institutional design and redesign, especially if you are tinkering with an already functioning democratic constitution. Among the most important of these critical insights contravened throughout by the CONCOM Constitution in its grand constitutional vision for the Philippines, I only list 7. A, the folly of hyper-rationality, which is the mistaken belief that just because the formal rules are changed, the old behavior of politicians will also change. B, the importance of sequencing of reforms based on the quote-unquote unsimultaneous time horizons, unquote, of different reforms for them to work, as against the concept of Big Bang, grand bargain, long list of reforms introduced at one go. C, the danger of quote-unquote over-reforming, because reforms introduce new problems and at times can be worse than the problem initially being addressed. Related terms are, quote-unquote, reform should correct those flaws as specifically as possible, and better the devil you know than the devil you do not know. D, underestimating the law of unintended consequences, where new institutions do not function the way the designers originally intended. In fact, They function opposite of the framer's intention. Plain English translation is the road to hell is paved with the best of intentions. E, the crucial role of path dependency. Basically, who are first empowered by the introduction of the new constitution that would determine the manner how the reforms are later shaped. Hence, the overwhelming importance of the transitory provisions of the new constitution. F, the important distinctions among macro level, for example, system of government, unitary federal, meso level, for example, electoral system or party system, and micro level, for example, legislative sub-rules, okay, institutional reforms, and their implication for constitutional engineering. G, the danger of excessive optimism in reforms, because it can easily lead to excessive disillusionment. Afterwards, as would most likely happen with reforms with exaggerated promises. But even as a text of the CONCOM Constitution ended up being longer than the 1987 Constitution and identified sweeping revisions of the current Constitution it was tasked to review, it still failed to do what for me is its most important homework. This is to write a Constitution that has a believable transition plan on how to move from the current unitary to the new federal state, the most institutionally complex experiment this country will undertake under democratic conditions, that its constitution so audaciously identified as its end goal. For while the CONCOM federal constitution has the temerity to eternally lock the country and all future generations of Filipinos to federalism by constitutionally entrenching federalism through an eternity clause, Section 4, Article 21, where no constitutional amendment or revision can change its federal character, it is nevertheless willing to leave the country to wander indefinitely in an institutional wilderness as it lacked a map for the transition itself. Instead of a credible map, it creates an all-powerful Federal Transition Commission, henceforth Transition Commission, that will not simply oversee the transition, but would do the task that the consultative committee, after being given almost 5 months and funded millions of pesos, should have done in the first place, the actual plan for the transition, similar to other unitary countries like Spain, Belgium, South Africa, Iraq, and Nepal that adopted federal constitutions. That the CONCOM Constitution fails to provide a crucial transition plan is not surprising, given that both RBH number 8 and the PDP-Laban Constitution also failed most miserably to give the country the all-important plan on how to get from point A to point B. The PDP-Laban best manifested this dismal failure by leaving its article transitory provisions, Article 18, empty, with the footnote carrying the lamest of excuse, quote-unquote, understudy. But at least the PDP-Laban Constitution provides a serious transition plan for its federalism in its article on regional and local government, Article 10. But once analyzed, its roadmap for an evolutionary transition could easily get stuck in the middle of nowhere, as its terribly flawed institutional design would paradoxically result in giving more veto powers to the central government in controlling the devolution of powers to the region, Section 24, Article 10 of PDP-Laban, than found in the 1987 Constitution, while succeeding in empowering local politicians to build regional bases, making the transition for some from local warlords to regional warlords by giving the interim regional commission not only monopoly of executive powers, but also legislative powers at the regional level, Section 28B and Section 28E, and also making that regional commission an appointment super body of the region for at least 5 years that would create the regional bureaucracies. Hence leveling the region, hence leveling up clientelistic levels from provincial to regional. Section 28C. As if a cruel joke, the transition plan does indeed fulfill PDP-Laban's often declared promise and assurance of arriving at a truly uniquely Filipino federalism, but in a dreadful manner of bringing Filipinos to a place that is neither here nor there, as many of its features combine some of the worst features of unitary and federal systems. The CONCOM Constitution seemed to have learned the wrong lesson in PDP-Laban's folly by not even daring to plan its transition for federalism. By doing so, many of the hardest questions of how to affect its federalism, the answers to which may transform this CONCOM Constitution from a grocery list to a more serious blueprint of governance in the next decades of this country, were avoided. No wonder the consultative committee finished its constitution 2 weeks ahead of President Duterte's SONA. It passed this crucial, dirty, and most difficult job to someone else. But in coming up with the Transition Commission, the CONCOM Constitution does not simply pass the pen for it to write down and implement the transition plan, but provides it with a shotgun to preside the transition by bestowing the Transition Commission with all-encompassing powers for its vague transition process. Okay? See Section 2, Article 22 of the original version, especially 2D, quote, to exercise all powers necessary and proper to ensure a smooth, speedy, and successful transition, unquote. Its initial plan was to have the incumbent president also as the transition president by heading the 11-person Transition Commission. The 10 other members are to be chosen by a search committee whose members are to be chosen by the president himself, thus giving him full control of both the committee and the Transition Commission. Because the CONCOM refused the call to explicitly ban the incumbent president from running for president in their new constitution, as it argued that it will be undemocratic and discriminatory because it singles out one person, what happens is a double bonanza for the incumbent president. First, he is allowed to run in the new constitution, and second, as transition president with additional powers, enjoys a grossly advantageous position if he eventually chooses to run under the new constitution. Note that in this sense, the institutional design of the CONCOM transition, underneath its more polished language, is actually similar to the quasi-revolutionary powers of both RBH 8 and the House Concurrent Resolution number 9 that was passed on January 16, 2018, that were all tailor-made for President Duterte as incumbent president and re-electionist candidate. The original CONCOM idea was on June 30, 2022, coinciding with the end of the term of the new president and the start of the new president, who initially could have been the same person. The Transition Commission would not have only come up with a plan for the transition, but also have implemented it. See Section 2C, Article 12, original version, Okay? I quote, to organize, reorganize, and fully establish the federal government and the governments of the federated regions in accordance with the Constitution, unquote. Since the CONCOM members in their public statements specifically target the May 2019 local and national elections as also the time of the plebiscite for their constitution, this means the transition from plan to execution is to be done in just 3 years. These are twin horrors in constitutional engineering and are classic cases of brute political factors overriding any institutional design logic. First, this means that the plebiscite campaign will have to compete with the noise of the campaign of thousands of local officials and senatorial candidates. This will definitely drown out the needed careful deliberation of the most fundamental decision a citizen can make, which is a yes or no decision on whether to accept a new constitution that will now serve as the most basic institutional framework of his or her existence. This piggybacking is sheer folly, considering that the March 2018's SWS survey showed only 1 out of 4 Filipinos has a minimalist understanding of federalism. Government propaganda will not significantly increase that percentage in the 60 or 90-day campaign period, even if that was the only thing that will be discussed, which will not even be the case. Remember that the last time a plebiscite was piggybacked with other issues is the orchestrated plebiscite of Marcos' 1973 martial law constitution, supposedly done from January 10 to 15, 1973. Second, just for the sake of argument, if all the immense complexity of the CONCOM Constitution, which as I have argued is a long grocery list, is executed in just 3 years, there is a very high risk of bringing the country not into a dizzying pace of change, but, as institutional design literature has warned in terms of unintended consequences, of bringing the country to near standstill because of the chaos of the enormity of the task needed to create all the new institutions of the CONCOM Constitution. But this initial translation plan of the CONCOM has been revised by the intervention of the very hand that created it. President Duterte responds to the challenge of the critics of a ban Duterte provision by asking the CONCOM to write down the provision barring him from running in 2022. He raises the ante even more as he asks his CONCOM to write down another provision calling for presidential and vice presidential elections next year because he promises to resign once the Constitution is ratified in 2019, and thereby creating a supposed vacancy on who will be the transition president who will oversee the shift to federalism. It is very difficult to take the president seriously when he promises to resign, since he has promised to resign on so many issues that irritate him. And this promise to resign in 2019 might yet be of the same weight as his campaign promise in 2016 to resign if the first 6 months of his presidency he did not eradicate drugs and corruption in the country. My reading here is that his promise to resign come 2019 is simultaneously a bluff and also indicative of the lack of seriousness in the output of his own COMCOM, probably because he knows very well that the real writing of the Constitution will happen in the Congress, and with his lieutenants fully in control of the House, no way would they allow him to bid them goodbye midway in his term. The CONCOM ban on his re-election is a significant step in the right direction and one key institutional challenge to protect democracy is to commit the final outcome of Congress, if ever, to contain this crucial ban. However, the attempt to cut short this term is clearly a retrogressive one because this undermines the electoral mandate of the 16.6 million who voted for Duterte. But even worse than Duterte's is the term of Vice President Leni Robredo, who is dragged into this stunt and whose term will also be cut short by the request of Duterte. In the case of Robredo, it is not just the 14.4 million who voted her who would be disenfranchised of their vote, but also she herself, who has no plan to abandon her mandate and is actually the constitutional successor of the 1987 Constitution if the President decides to resign. This could only be described as a reverse power grab or a sort of impeachment via new constitution and is utterly contemptuous of the electoral, hence democratic mandate bestowed on her by the 1987 Constitution. Mad as the stand of the President, especially on the VP, madder still is the CONCOM agreeing to this cavalier suggestion of constitutional strangulation of democratic mandates. For one moment, I was expecting someone from the 22-man and one-woman CONCOM would resign in protest because of this democratic disenfranchisement. In fact, I did not even hear any strong protest about this, only statements that Duterte's request suggestion will complicate things during the transition. Take note that we have not even started the new constitution, and yet what we are already seeing are immediately both institutional and democratic erosions, as the one-man wrecking crew that had already eroded democratic institutions under the 1987 Constitution is already giving a sneak preview of what he will do under the new federal constitution. That, notwithstanding all recent pronouncements to the contrary, he will most likely still lead as incumbent president, transition president, or re-elected president if he could get away with it. To conclude, the institutional design of the CONCOM Constitution does not move us far from the two other constitutions. All three are failures as federal constitutions. But the CONCOM's real achievement is political. In reviving the Duterte administration's charter change campaign, after it was bludgeoned last January 2018 by House Speaker Pantaleon Alvarez and the lower house, as they brazenly tried to use charter change to push for a no-election scenario in May 2019 to self-servingly extend their terms in office. As evidence, here we are again, even on a rainy day, in this Senate hearing on yet another round of more of the same institutional design nonsense. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Pilapil.